The room is quiet, but the tension is unmistakable. It is late in the war. London is darkened by blackout curtains, its streets still scarred by years of bombing. Inside a government office lit by a single desk lamp, papers are spread across polished wood loan agreements, shipping schedules, reserve statements. Numbers are circled in pencil. Margins are filled with urgent notes. Britain is still fighting, but it is running out of money. Not ammunition, not courage, money. Across the Atlantic, vaults are full. Factories run at full capacity. Credit is available at a price. And in this moment, a decision is being made that will not be announced to the public, debated in Parliament, or remembered in victory speeches. Britain is about to mortgage its empire to survive the war. That is the mystery at the heart of this story. How a nation that ruled the world quietly became a debtor, and how the cost of that debt outlasted the war itself. To understand how this happened, you have to look beyond battles and generals, and into ledgers, reserves, and agreements signed far from the front lines. Because Britain did not lose its empire on the battlefield, it lost it in the balance sheet. At the start of the Second World War, Britain still appeared powerful. It commanded vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Its navy dominated sea lanes. London remained the center of global finance, with sterling still used far beyond Britain's shores. But appearances hid fragility. The First World War had already weakened Britain's finances. Massive borrowing, loss of overseas investments, and the abandonment of the gold standard had reduced its economic resilience. The empire still generated trade, but it no longer produced the surpluses it once had. When the Second War began, Britain entered it with courage and debt. From the first months of fighting, money flowed outward at a terrifying rate. Britain paid for food from North America, oil from abroad, raw materials for industry, and weapons it could not produce fast enough at home. Each shipment drained reserves. Gold left the country quietly. Foreign investments were sold. Dollar balances shrank. By 1940, the situation was already critical. Britain could still fight, but it could not pay indefinitely. The government understood this long before the public did. Internal reports warned that without external financing, Britain would face insolvency within years, perhaps sooner. The empire, vast as it was, could not be liquidated quickly enough to fund a modern industrial war. And so Britain turned to the only place with the capacity to help: America. At first, the relationship was carefully framed. Assistance was described as support for democracy, for stability, for shared values. But behind closed doors, negotiations were brutally practical. America would supply weapons, food, fuel, and shipping. Britain would provide collateral. That collateral was not symbolic, it was real. Gold reserves were transferred across the Atlantic. Overseas assets were pledged. Strategic bases were leased. Future earnings were committed. The empire itself, its ports, resources, and revenue streams became security against wartime credit. This was not charity. It was finance. Each agreement deepened dependence. Each shipment arrived with conditions attached. Britain retained political sovereignty, but economic autonomy was slipping away. The public saw convoys arriving. They did not see the contracts behind them. As the war intensified, so did the costs. U-boats threatened shipping. Repairing bomb damage drained resources. Supporting allies stretched budgets further. Britain's economy was mobilized to the limit, but output alone could not solve the problem. Liquidity mattered more than production, and liquidity came from abroad. By the middle of the war, Britain's financial position was so strained that even sympathetic American officials worried about repayment. Discussions shifted from short-term support to long-term restructuring. How would Britain pay after the war? What would happen to sterling? What role would the empire play in repayment? These were not academic questions. They shaped decisions in real time. Britain began making concessions not publicly, but structurally. Trade preferences were adjusted. Imperial economic controls were loosened. Commitments were made about future openness and currency arrangements. The empire was no longer just a source of strength. It was a bargaining chip. This marked the first major turning point. Britain was still a great power militarily, but financially, it was becoming subordinate. The war had transformed the relationship between the two allies. One supplied credit, the other absorbed debt. And debt, unlike gratitude, does not fade with time. What began as emergency support was quietly evolving into a new hierarchy, one defined not by flags or fleets, but by balance sheets. The empire had survived invasion threats and global conflict. Now it faced a different danger. It was being mortgaged, piece by piece, to stay alive. And once a nation's future income is promised away, victory comes with conditions. That is where this story truly begins. By the middle years of the war, the financial reality Britain faced could no longer be disguised even within government circles. The emergency phase was over. This was now structural dependence. Every month, ships arrived carrying food, fuel, aircraft, vehicles, and raw materials. Every month, the bill grew larger. Britain's ability to pay in dollars was exhausted. Gold reserves had been shipped abroad. Overseas investments had been sold off at discounted prices. What remained were promises future earnings pledged to secure present survival. The empire was no longer funding the war. It was underwriting the debt. Behind closed doors, negotiations intensified. British officials were no longer asking if assistance would continue, but on what terms. And those terms were shifting. The lending power understood something crucial. Britain had no alternative. Other empires were collapsing. Neutral markets were inaccessible. Domestic austerity could not replace foreign supply. If credit stopped, the war effort would slow and potentially fail. That leverage changed the tone of discussions. American negotiators increasingly linked wartime assistance to post-war conditions. These were not framed as demands, but as expectations. A world rebuilt on open trade. Fewer imperial preferences. Freer access to markets long controlled by Britain and its colonies. The language was cooperative. The implications were not. Imperial trade systems designed to keep commerce within the empire were now obstacles. They restricted access. They favored sterling. They limited dollar circulation. From a creditor's perspective, they reduced the ability to recover loans. So pressure mounted. Britain was encouraged to commit to dismantling preferential systems after the war. Currency controls were questioned. Plans for post-war reconstruction were scrutinized. The assumption was clear. The old imperial economic order would not survive unchanged. All of this happened while Britain was still fighting for survival. This created a profound imbalance. Decisions that would shape decades of economic policy were being made under wartime duress. There was no public debate, no electoral mandate, only urgency. And urgency narrows choices. By the later stages of the war, Britain's debt obligations had reached extraordinary levels. Exact figures varied depending on accounting methods, but the direction was unmistakable. Britain was transforming from the world's largest creditor into one of its largest debtors. The empire, once a financial cushion, now functioned as collateral. Bases across the Atlantic were leased in exchange for naval support. Strategic positions were tied to long-term agreements. Access rights, logistics corridors, and future cooperation were formalized, not temporarily, but permanently. Each agreement reduced flexibility. At the same time, Britain's domestic economy was being reshaped by scarcity. Rationing tightened. Civilian consumption was suppressed. Infrastructure investment was postponed. Living standards fell even as victory drew closer. This had consequences. The longer the war lasted, the weaker Britain's post-war position became. Industry aged, infrastructure deteriorated, skilled labor was exhausted, and the resources required for rebuilding were precisely those Britain could not finance alone. The paradox was stark. Victory was approaching, but solvency was not. As the end of the war came into view, discussions shifted decisively toward the future. What would Britain look like in peace? How would it repay its obligations? What role would the empire play in generating the revenue needed to service debt? The answers were uncomfortable. Sterling, once a global currency, was weakened. Its convertibility would be limited. Capital controls would be necessary. And the empire, far from being a unified economic bloc, was increasingly restless, its own finances strained by war demands. Britain faced pressure from both directions. From abroad, creditors expected liberalization, openness, and repayment. From within, the public expected reconstruction, welfare, and relief from years of sacrifice. Both required money Britain did not have. This tension defined the late war period. Policies were drafted that attempted to satisfy both demands, but compromise often meant delay. Delay increased dependence, and dependence deepened the power shift. American officials understood that Britain's choices were narrowing. They also understood that shaping the post-war order, now while leverage was greatest, would lock in advantages for decades. This was not presented as domination. It was presented as modernization, a new global system, rules-based trade, stable currencies, shared prosperity. But the starting positions were unequal. One side entered the post-war world with surplus capacity, intact infrastructure, and financial dominance. The other entered exhausted, indebted, and constrained. By the final year of the war, the transformation was irreversible. Britain would emerge victorious but financially bound, its empire intact on maps, but weakened in practice. Its influence preserved in diplomacy, but limited in economics. The second major turning point had passed. Britain was no longer negotiating as an equal partner. It was negotiating as a borrower seeking time. And time, in finance, is never free. The war was being won, but the peace was already being mortgaged. What remained was the reckoning when emergency agreements hardened into permanent realities, and the cost of survival became clear not in ruins, but in repayments. That reckoning would arrive faster than anyone publicly admitted. The war ended in celebration. But for Britain's finances, the real crisis was just beginning. Victory brought no relief to the balance sheet. In many ways, it made the problem worse. During the war, emergency measures had hidden the full scale of Britain's economic weakness. Controls masked shortages. Deferred spending postponed collapse. Wartime solidarity softened the language of debt. Peace stripped away those protections. The bills did not disappear when the fighting stopped. They arrived all at once. Britain emerged from the war with enormous obligations. Its overseas assets were largely gone. Its gold reserves were depleted. Its industries were worn down by years of maximum output and minimal reinvestment. Cities needed rebuilding. Infrastructure needed repair. And the population demanded something it had been promised throughout the war: security, housing, jobs, healthcare, stability. All of it required money. But Britain's earnings capacity was limited. Exports struggled to recover. Shipping was damaged. Markets that had once relied on British goods had found new suppliers. The empire, itself weakened by wartime strain, could no longer be counted on to generate effortless surpluses. Sterling was under pressure. Confidence in the currency was fragile, both at home and abroad. Without controls, capital would flee. With controls, trade would suffer. Either path carried risk. This was the breaking point. Britain had to secure post-war financing or face economic crisis severe enough to undo the victory it had just achieved. Negotiations resumed with urgency. What followed was one of the most consequential financial agreements in British history. A large loan was arranged to stabilize Britain's position, support reconstruction, and allow a transition to peacetime trade. But it came with conditions. Sterling would become convertible. Imperial trade preferences would be dismantled. Markets would be opened. Controls would be relaxed. These terms were presented as steps toward a modern global economy, and in theory, they were. In practice, they exposed Britain's vulnerability. Convertibility meant that holders of sterling could exchange it for dollars, and once that door opened, demand surged. Years of pent-up claims flooded out. Reserves drained rapidly. The experiment lasted only weeks before it had to be suspended. The damage was done. Britain had demonstrated publicly that it could not defend its currency without restrictions. Confidence suffered. Policy autonomy narrowed further. The empire's economic coherence weakened as preferential arrangements were dismantled. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a controlled failure, and it benefited others. As Britain struggled to adjust, financial leadership consolidated elsewhere. Trade increasingly settled in dollars. Reserves accumulated outside London. International institutions designed during the war years now operated in practice, often reinforcing the same hierarchy that wartime lending had created. Britain remained influential, but it was no longer central. The empire felt the change acutely. Colonies that had been tightly integrated into Britain's economic system now faced a different reality. Sterling shortages, trade liberalization, and declining support weakened old ties. Nationalist movements, already energized by wartime promises, found opportunity in Britain's diminished capacity to enforce economic control. Independence was no longer just political. It was financial. Britain faced impossible trade-offs: maintain global commitments and risk insolvency, or retrench and accept decline. Step by step, retrenchment won. Bases were closed. Military spending was reduced. Overseas obligations were reconsidered. Each decision was framed as pragmatic. Together, they marked the unraveling of imperial reach. Who benefited? The creditor gained stability and influence. Emerging nations gained space to assert sovereignty. A new financial order took hold, one less dependent on empire, more dependent on markets and currency power. Who paid the price? Britain did. Not in humiliation, but in limitation. Living standards recovered slowly. A welfare state was built, but under tight fiscal discipline. Growth resumed, but within constraints shaped by external obligations. Policy choices were filtered through the lens of balance of payments risk. This was the true cost of wartime survival. Britain had not lost its empire in a single moment. It had lost it through a sequence of rational decisions made under pressure. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they produced decline. The breaking point was not defeat. It was dependence. By the late 1942, the outcome was clear. Britain was no longer a global financial power. Its empire was no longer economically sustainable, and the agreement signed to win the war now defined the limits of peace. The reckoning was complete. What remained was to live with the consequences and to reinterpret history in a way that softened the truth. Victory speeches celebrated endurance. Public memory honored sacrifice. But behind the narrative, the ledger told a different story. Britain had survived the war by mortgaging its future, and futures, once sold, are difficult to reclaim. The final chapter would not be written in crisis, but in acceptance. By the early 1952, the transformation was undeniable. Britain was no longer managing a temporary post-war adjustment. It was operating within permanent limits. The empire still appeared on maps. Flags still flew over distant territories. But the financial foundation that once sustained global power was gone. Decisions were now constrained by external balances, reserve levels, and the expectations of creditors. This was not collapse. It was contraction. Britain adapted with remarkable discipline. A comprehensive welfare system was built. Education expanded. Public health improved. These achievements were real and costly. Funding them required careful economic management, export growth, and restraint abroad. The margin for error was thin. Every major policy decision was filtered through one question: can we afford this without triggering a balance of payments crisis? That question reshaped Britain's global role. Military commitments were reduced. strategic ambitions narrowed. Overseas presence shifted from dominance to diplomacy. Where force had once enforced influence, negotiation now replaced it. This was not simply a loss of will, it was a recognition of reality. The empire, once an economic engine, had become a liability. Maintaining control required investment Britain could no longer spare. And as colonies moved toward independence, the cost-benefit equation shifted decisively. Letting go became cheaper than holding on. Financial dependence had quietly rewritten imperial logic. Sterling, once a global reserve currency, retreated into a regional role. Capital controls remained a fact of life. Trade policy prioritized stability over expansion. Britain became a middle power, respected, experienced, but constrained. Meanwhile, the financial system that emerged from the war matured. Global trade increasingly settled in a single currency. International institutions standardized rules. Capital flowed through channels designed during the war years, but fully activated in peace. The architecture Britain had helped design now functioned without it at the center. This was the final irony. Britain had shaped the modern financial order to survive the war. That same order then accelerated its relative decline. History often presents this period as inevitable. A natural passing of the torch. A peaceful transition from empire to modern state. But inevitability is a story told after outcomes are known. At the time, the choices felt urgent, constrained, and unavoidable. Britain did not choose decline. It chose survival again and again, under conditions it did not control. Those choices carried costs. The empire dissolved faster than expected. Influence shifted quietly. Financial sovereignty narrowed. And the distance between wartime victory and post-war reality created a lasting sense of dissonance in national memory. This is why the story matters. Because it challenges a simple narrative. Britain did not lose its empire because it fought the wrong war. It lost it because it financed the right one at any cost. Debt replaced dominance. Credit replaced control. And once a nation becomes dependent on external finance to sustain its role, power changes shape. This lesson echoes far beyond Britain. Modern states rarely fall through invasion. They weaken through obligations, through agreements signed under pressure, through systems that reward stability today while limiting autonomy tomorrow. Britain's experience was not unique. It was early. The war ended with victory parades and rebuilt cities. But beneath that renewal lay a quieter transformation, one measured not in ruins, but in repayments. By mortgaging its empire, Britain bought time. Time to fight. Time to rebuild. Time to transition. What it could not buy back was its old position. Empires can survive defeat. They rarely survive debt. That is the legacy of Britain's wartime financing, not a story of betrayal, but of consequence. A reminder that in global power, the most decisive battles are often fought far from the front lines on paper, in silence, with terms that outlast the war itself.